Thank you for coming to yet another Open Dialogue event. I am Sood. I'm the director of the USC Open Dialogue Project. And I start every event with three expectations or rules for a constructive conversation. So just as a reminder, first rule is let go of winning. So you're all here with your priors about free speech and what you think about it. I just want you to kind of a little bit let go of your priors and remember what they are, but don't be in this frame of mind that my priors are right and this conversation is going to prove that my priors are right. Second rule is once you let go of winning, you start being curious. So be curious, be here to learn, try to figure out why some people think the way they think, what are the pros and cons. Just try to understand different perspectives. And the last rule is focus on ideas and not people. So don't call people names, but you can criticize an idea as much as you want. You can engage with an idea as much as you want. And the last rule is USC policy that we're having a conversation or a value that we don't disrupt the conversation. There's going to be plenty of time after the fireside chat for Q&A from audience, and so be ready with your questions then. So with that, I would like to welcome Provost Guzman, who will give welcome remarks and introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here. This terrific event. This event is one series that, like the others, is reflecting of our work mission's commitment to open dialogue, civil disagreement, and to debate. And I want to thank Professor Sood who is the founding director of the USC Open Dialogue Project, for bringing us together and creative work that's done all year to continue to do the Open Dialogue Project. In the category of thanks, I also want to thank our various partners, the USC chapter of the Heterodox Academy, the Center for the Political Future, USC Gould School of Law, obviously, and Voices for Liberty. And most of all of you for being here. It turns out it's easier to have open dialogue when there's people to dialogue with. Thank you for this. So the conversation today is going to engage a question we've all seen. We've all seen it in the public, but we've certainly all seen it on campus. These are all questions, there's a whole set of questions that you're familiar with. How committed are we as a university to the notion that the clash of ideas is really the one way we know to discover truth? What can be said? What speech rules apply on campus? How are they the same or how are they different as other parts of society? How do they differ within our campus community? What are the differences between standing in the public spaces in campus, standing in front of a classroom, sitting in a classroom, speaking on social media? What is the difference depending on your position in the university, faculty, staff, students, administrators? All those questions are ones we're familiar with, and a lot of them don't have clear answers. The very first day I studied economics in graduate school. My very first day, my macroeconomics professor told us what his ambitions were for us for the course. And he said, by the end of this course, my goal is for you to be profoundly confused. Mere confusion is not enough. On these topics, people who are certain are either fooling themselves or attempting to fool you. People who are merely confused can't operate in the space because all they see is the confusion. People who are profoundly confused find a way to embrace the vexing challenges where different values, all of which we care about, are in tension with one another. Where different people, all of whom we care about, have different perspectives. That's the profound confusion we need to see. There's no answers. There's no bottom line, I know all the answers. But by becoming profoundly confused, we can really make progress and be in a better place. So to help us be as profoundly confused as possible, we have two tremendous experts on these subjects. First, we're honored and delighted to welcome Nadine Strossen, the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law, Emerita from New York Law School. She served as the president of the American Civil Liberty Union from 1991 to 2008, one of the nation's most visible participants in these kinds of debates. And across decades of scholarship and public intellectual contributions, She's been a leading voice arguing for strong protections for speech, including speech that we may find offensive. And joining her in the discussion is Dean Franita Tolson, Dean and Carl Mason Franklin Chair of Law here at USC Gould. Dean Tolson's a nationally recognized scholar of democracy and election law, and someone I'm always proud to call a colleague. We're fortunate to have her leadership here at USC Gould as Dean of the Law School, and also her considerable expertise today to shed light on the topics of the conversation. So I'm going to get out of the way because they both know a lot more about this than I do. Please welcome Dean Tolson and Professor Strossen.
Do you share a microphone, I guess? We're looking for another, if there's only one. Okay, we'll share.
So let me first thank all of you for joining us. It's a profound honor to be able to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for coming to USC. I think that this topic is especially important given that we're living in. And I also think that, I used to teach First Amendment, and I was glad to stop teaching it because I was profoundly confused. So I am happy to release my practice and having this conversation with you today. So the professor in me always wants to start with a clean slate. In today's audience, we have people of different backgrounds, people who study different areas of law. We have people who don't even do law, right? But they are profoundly interested in this question. So in light of our differences, can you explain in kind of broad strokes about the First Amendment principles that protect free speech? And also, what do most people get wrong about it?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Franita. We agreed we can be on a first name basis. And thanks to all of the wonderful folks who organized this event. As I said to the provost, I give about 200 public presentations per year. I deal with many, many campuses, and this one truly has been outstanding in the organizational effort. So I'm really grateful to your commitment to all of the topics that we are now going to increase our profound confusion about. So as you know, Franita, in law school, we often have courses that are at least an entire semester to answer the first question that you asked me: what is freedom of speech under First Amendment standards? So this is definitely a simplification, but it is not an oversimplification. What I have discovered through wrestling with all of the cases and all of the principles is that First Amendment free speech law really boils down to two common sense principles. And bear that in mind, because one of the biggest misunderstandings people have is that First Amendment free speech law is ridiculously extreme and absolutist. And we especially get critics from other countries decrying our American exceptionalism. No. The principles really make common sense. First of all, government is permitted to restrict the speech that is the most dangerous. Secondly, government is prohibited from imposing the restrictions that are the most dangerous. Common sense, right? So let me just amplify in a bit more detail about each of those two core principles. What is the speech that is the most dangerous? Former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis really said it the best in an early, what was then essentially a dissenting position, but has become embraced unanimously by the modern Supreme Court. He coined the term emergency principle. Government may restrict speech when considered under all of the facts and circumstances. So you look at the surrounding factual context. The speech poses an emergency. It either directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific serious harm. And many of you will have heard from the news, even if you haven't studied First Amendment law, some examples of speech that satisfies this emergency principle. One example is intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently. Another is what we lawyers call a true threat, the adjective to distinguish it from the looser, vaguer way we use the term threat in everyday speech. No, a true threat, consistent with the emergency principle, the speaker targets a particular individual or small group of individuals and intends to instill a reasonable fear that the target is going to be subject to violence. And note, the speaker doesn't have to intend to actually carry out the violence, but to instill a reasonable fear is already causing great damage, right? Because if you're afraid you're going to be attacked, that is going to inhibit your own freedom of speech and freedom of movement. So that's the speech that is most dangerous. Government can and should already restrict it. What about the speech restrictions that are the most dangerous? Those are the restrictions that are justified or thought to be justified, not because they pose an emergency, but rather because of disagreement with or disapproval of the viewpoint, the idea, the message, or the content. This is usually called the viewpoint neutrality principle or the content neutrality principle. No matter how many of us may loathe and vaguely fear the speech because of its message or its idea, that is never a justification for suppressing it. We have to answer it back, ignore it, refute it, argue with it, whatever strategy we choose to deal with the idea. But short of the emergency, which considers not just the idea of the speech, but again, the overall context posing imminent or actual danger, short of that standard, government should not interfere.
I find that, our concept of what constitutes an emergency has become really, really blurred.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get it wrong, right? Like, is it, in thinking about the broader context, when you talked about the idea that it has to be sort of reasonable, reasonable based on whose assessment, right? Is it sort of objective?
Yes.
Is it about the group? How should we think about these two fairly clear ways that you've articulated First Amendment doctrine? How should we think about that in policing the line between what's allowed and what's truly an emergency?
So, as you know, Professor and Dean, right, this is a struggle, and we have an eminent jurist in our audience, judges as well as professors and the rest of us have to struggle to implement even fairly specific legal tests or principles in the context of actual facts. To come back to that word, reasonable people can and do differ, right? So agreeing on the principle is an essential starting point, but we can disagree about whether the particular facts actually satisfy them. I think that is inevitable. Language is never going to be sufficiently precise. I think that, the European countries and some other countries that have a code-based system of law where supposedly, the statutes are written out in such detail that they supposedly eliminate human discretion, I think that's a fool's errand. And in addition, even assuming for the sake of argument, we could be so clear and so precise to anticipate every single factual circumstance, we also want the rule of law to be tempered with a sense of equity and justice and fairness. So a phrase that we lawyers use all the time, but it's also a theme throughout the American system of government, is a delicate balance, right? Too much discretion on the part of government to pick and choose ideas that it disfavors because maybe they might potentially lead to some harm. That is too much discretion, and predictably, it has been used in this country and others to disproportionately target ideas that are unpopular, speakers that are controversial or unpopular. On the other hand, a complete absence of discretion, I think, is impossible and probably would be undesirable. But let me give you all one particular factual scenario that I often get asked about, where esteemed judges have reached different conclusions. I don't think any of the decisions are final. I think they're all on some stage of appeal or negotiation. But this is Donald Trump speaking on January 6th, a couple of years ago, and claims have been made that not only the people who committed acts of violence and vandalism and trespass should be punished, but that Donald Trump should be culpable under that category of speech that satisfies the emergency principle that I referred to earlier. Intentional incitement of imminent violent or lawless conduct that is likely to actually happen imminently. And judges and others, including First Amendment experts, have parsed, again, not only the words themselves, but the overall context, his whole speech. What was the situation of the crowd? What were the facts that led to the gathering of that crowd? And at least one judge has concluded it comes very close to the line, but it does not cross the line because, among other things, Trump said something like "go in peace," right? But another judge reached the opposite conclusion and said, well, that, in the overall context of everything else that was said, Trump's power as president, the months-long campaign leading up to that gathering, when he said "go in peace," that really didn't have enough of a defanging connotation. So reasonable people can disagree, but at least agreement on the principles, I think, is really important. Prior to the second half of the 20th century, we had not adopted, or the Supreme Court had not adopted, the emergency standard, and it instead enforced something called the bad tendency test. Speech that might potentially indirectly cause great harm could be punished. And it's for that reason that every advocate for every social justice cause, every political dissident or social minority was subject to punishment for speech. Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail in the early 1960s. How many of you know what he was in jail for? What was his crime? Crime, quote unquote, and it was a crime under existing law, was to exercise what we now long have considered the most fundamental free speech right in a democracy, to peacefully protest against laws that are themselves unconstitutional, deeply violative of equality principles. But the law at the time allowed vague fears that harm and disorder and disturbance can result from these peaceful protests that he languished in jail.
I think that's what makes this so hard, right? The context-specific nature of the determination of whether or not something's protected. I often think about the distinction between political speech and hate speech, right? Because so much of hate speech is also political speech. How should we police that? Speaking of context, though, since we're on a college campus, how should we think about this distinction between protected and unprotected speech, particularly as it pertains to, spaces on the campus that can kind of mimic like a public square or a place where arguably we invite speech, right? We invite students to articulate their views in ways that, could potentially raise some concerns under the First Amendment, depending on if that is protected or unprotected speech, right? So how should we think about that conversation?
Great series of questions. So first of all, let me start by making a point that many people are unfamiliar with, and that is that The First Amendment and its free speech guarantees only applies to the government and government institutions. So if you are on a private campus or any other private sector entity, you have no First Amendment free speech rights at all. That said, most private campuses have voluntarily agreed to honor the same First Amendment principles that they would be required to abide by if they were public universities from the perspective of truth-seeking, academic freedom, pedagogical effectiveness. So from now on, I'm just going to talk about campuses, but please, in general, without distinguishing public from private, but please recognize that the First Amendment doesn't directly apply to the private sector. So you're exactly right, Franita, that context is really important. And in the areas and contexts on campus that are analogous to the proverbial public square out in public streets and parks where free speech is at its greatest flourishing, in the equivalent areas on campus, the mall or the quad or sidewalks where people aren't blocking the sidewalks, are completely open to the same kinds of First Amendment free speech activities that would be permitted in the regular public square. Here in California, I have to salute your sister campus, Berkeley, and its famous free speech movement from the early 1960s. That was exactly the principle that the students with the support from the faculty were agitating for. Until that point, the campus had a rule that you cannot engage in political expression, even on the most public areas of campus. And interestingly enough, the reason that the students were seeking access to campus for free speech purposes was that there were a group of students who had gone to Mississippi and other parts of the Deep South to enroll disenfranchised Black Americans to exercise their right to vote, to lobby for what ultimately became the Voting Rights Act, but it wasn't enforced yet. And they were trying to get other students to sign petitions to support voting rights and other civil rights, and they were banned from doing that on campus. So that is all passé. You can do all of that on those areas of campus. In other areas of campus, such as a classroom or a laboratory or a library, that is set aside for specific educational purposes. Any other expression that is inconsistent with those purposes is not allowed. And that means that, for example, I very much defend free speech, as you know, but if somebody came in here and started trying to give a math lecture, I would say, please get out of here. And conversely, if somebody's trying to give a math lecture and I start ranting and raving about free speech, that would also be inappropriate. There's one other point I want to make, Franita, which I should have in response to your first question. In addition to the emergency principle, and let me say the emergency principle is consistent with what the Supreme Court has called this bedrock principle of viewpoint neutrality, that government may never punish speech solely because of disagreement with its viewpoint. So the emergency principle is consistent with that. The speech is not being restricted because of objection to its viewpoint. Also consistent with the emergency principle, with the viewpoint neutrality principle, are what we call content or viewpoint neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. Speech is not being restricted because of its viewpoint. It also doesn't cause an emergency, but it may interfere with certain other societal goals. So, for example, even though you may generally have peaceful protests on the campus quad, there could be a content neutral, viewpoint neutral, time, place, and manner restriction saying you may not, even on the quad, have a loud demonstration late at night because that is disturbing the peace and quiet of people who are trying to rest in the area.
So we covered students. Let's talk a little bit about faculty and staff. Right. So, to what extent should we think about this conversation and the protections of the First Amendment when it comes to faculty and staff, particularly if they're not acting necessarily in their professional capacity? Let's say they are, posting on social media or advocating their personal views. How, as universities, how should we think about that particular dimension of the fact that people have lives outside of work?
Exactly. Exactly, lives outside of work. And let me fold the faculty example into the larger category. Again, I'm going to talk about specifically about the public sector, because if you're working for the private sector, sorry, you don't have any First Amendment free speech rights.
Although California is
Oh,
different.
California
Yeah.
might, yes. Under the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But as your eminent dean wisely points out, in addition to the U.S. Constitution, every state has its own state constitution, and some of the state constitutional free speech guarantees have been interpreted by the state's highest court, which has final authority over in interpreting those constitutions, as extending to the private sector. In addition, there are certain state statutes. California has some that protect free speech on private sector campuses, including the famous Leonard Law. But, putting all of that aside, in general, I'm talking about the public sector. And you should not, it used to be in the first half of the 20th century, there was actually a famous decision by Oliver Wendell Holmes before he was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he, in his capacity as a Massachusetts Supreme Court justice, upheld the firing of a police officer who had made a controversial political statement off duty. And Holmes, writing for the court, said that's completely appropriate. You have a right to free speech, but you don't have the right to be a police officer. Well, that view is now passé, starting in the second half of the 20th century. We recognize that you should not have to give up your ordinary rights to free speech as a citizen as the price for working for the government, whether it's as a police officer, a firefighter, or a school teacher, or a state university professor. That said, we have seen countless examples of even tenured professors being investigated and suspended and disciplined and even fired for social media commentary. If you look at most of the controversies about faculty members, most of them do not have to do with statements in the classroom or in their professional capacity, but rather in their personal capacity. We had many, many examples after the horrible murder of Charlie Kirk, where many faculty members, teachers, other public sector employees were fired because they made statements that were viewed as insufficiently respectful of Charlie Kirk. So there's a big difference between what the law is and what the practice is. The law is that public sector employees have free speech rights to speak in their capacity as private citizens, not in their professional capacity, that when they're not speaking pursuant to their official duties, when they are addressing a matter of public concern. Now, public concern is defined very broadly, basically anything that has to do with any issue of general concern. It doesn't specifically have to be political, it can be cultural, social, and so forth. Then the courts have to engage in a balancing test. So we get another exercise of discretion where the courts weigh what is the value of the speech that the employee is engaged in. And the value is not only the value to the employee of expression, but also the value to the public, because freedom of speech protects not only the right of the speaker to convey information and ideas, but also the right of the rest of us to receive the information and ideas. And when somebody is a public university professor or a firefighter or a police officer, you name it, that person may, by virtue of public employment, have access to information or perspectives that are particularly valuable to the public. So on one side of the balance, you have the value of the expression. On the other side of the balance, you have how is there disruption to the workplace. And here is where the discretion in enforcement has been very debatable and controversial, because in my view, too many decision makers and even some courts have said, well, disruption can consist of public controversy that is generated by the faculty member statement. So, if members of the public get very exercised because the professor has made some controversial social media posts that damages the reputation of the school and that diverts attention on the part of members of the staff to respond to the public, my view, and I think the prevailing view in the courts, is no, you can't allow the controversy itself to be a negative factor that outweighs the free speech value, because that amounts to what the courts have called a heckler's veto. Think about it. If anybody disliked a statement, just totally hypothetically, that your esteemed law school dean makes about voting rights, and they get very incensed, they could drum up a campaign of other people to call the provost and pester the provost. She's causing a lot of trouble. And that would lead to viewpoint-based suppression, right? But in all candor, this is being worked out through the lower courts even as we speak.
I'm sure people complain from us about my work all the time. But, I wonder, particularly as an administrator, how do we operationalize some of this? Because in part, USC prides itself on our community, right? We like to think that we're inclusive and we welcome various viewpoints, even those that we don't necessarily agree with. But is there also a chance that, being inclusive can sort of descend into endorsement of views that kind of undermine the values that we stand for, and therefore, maybe there is a situation in which the heckler's veto makes sense, but how do we make sure we don't abuse it, right? So it's almost like, as administrators, we have to walk this fine line. We welcome viewpoints of different stripes, but not quite sure when to say, okay, this is not where we stand. How do we please stand?
I think the way you do that, Franita, is by having very firmly and clearly announced policies that are made clear to everybody in your community from the get-go. That is when they're applying for positions as faculty members, when they're considering applying here as students. So you have it in the recruiting materials, you have it in your handbooks, you have it in orientation, you have it on syllabi. You keep repeating it so that people understand that this is a university that defends and champions viewpoint diversity, freedom of speech, academic freedom. We do not endorse substantively any view that is expressed by any speaker. We are simply endorsing their right to be here, and if they are invited, and your opportunity as members of this community to invite them, to question them, to interrogate them, to debate with them. And I think once that becomes understood as part of the culture, nobody would even think that inviting a speaker is endorsing that speaker's views, with a couple exceptions. When you're talking about very rare, selective, indeed almost unique opportunities, such as inviting somebody to be a commencement speaker, there is some degree of endorsement there above and beyond what would be involved in a student group inviting a speaker. That said, if your standard is that you cannot invite a speaker who has ever said or done anything controversial, you're not going to have any speakers at all. So I think it would behoove, just totally thinking aloud. I think to anticipate these issues is really, really important, to have the policies in place so you don't wait until there's a controversy when you're trying to catch up and playing defense isn't so effective. But in the announcements that I've already talked about, I would add to it that even in a ceremonial, celebratory capacity, we are, of course, celebrating a human being who, by definition, is imperfect. And many of you may disagree with particular actions or statements that anybody we invite or honor has engaged in. But we are saluting what we think is positive about that person. And likewise, I would say, even with respect to speakers that a student group might invite, I would think it would be important for the students to have articulated some pedagogical value that results from inviting a speaker. And that can be the opposite of agreeing with the speaker's ideas. I mean, if there is a politician whose ideas you as a student group absolutely hold in contempt, but that person is influential and is exercising power, I would think that would be a reason to invite that person so that you would have a chance to engage with the ideas and either change your mind or, hopefully, better yet, change the speaker's mind.
So I think I agree with that, because it sounds to me like we're leaning in on this idea of the marketplace of ideas, right? Like, it's a very old concept, but it seems that in this day and age, it still has a role to play in our discourse. But I wonder the extent to which social media complicates this conversation, in part because, we can talk about, confronting speakers with peacefully. But it seems that, social media campaigns can really ramp up disinformation and misinformation in a way that might undermine the marketplace of ideas and the function that it's supposed to serve, right? You counter bad ideas with good ideas. Do you think that, in particular as we think about government's role in this, do you think that the calculus has changed such that there should be more regulation of the marketplace because of social media? Like, how should we think about how that has changed our conversations around the First Amendment?
The more it changes, the more it is the same, as that old French saying goes. Every new medium of communication throughout history has appropriately raised exactly these kinds of questions. Even the transition from oral to written speech, and certainly the advent of the printing press, and even in my lifetime, the advent of cable TV and video games and the internet itself, long before social media. The very fact that this medium is cheaper, faster, more accessible to more people, especially to more young people, which is always the special target of concern, on the one hand is cause for celebration for those of us who advocate human rights and see this as a potential tool for expanding human rights, but understandably a cause for countervailing concerns, because speech conveys bad and evil and wrong-headed ideas as well as positive and uplifting and constructive ideas. But all of these tools are media of communication. The content provided by we human beings ourselves. On the marketplace of ideas metaphor, I know Franita didn't say this, but most people, or at least many people, who paraphrase that metaphor get it wrong. They say, oh, you free speech defenders, you think that truth is always going to triumph over falsity, and good speech is always going to triumph over bad speech in the marketplace of ideas. How naive can you be? No, no, no. The marketplace of ideas metaphor, which was coined most memorably by Oliver Wendell Holmes in a famous early 20th century opinion, he talked about it as the better alternative to government censorship. Not that it is ultimately likely to produce truth, but it is more likely to do so than centralized control by a government authority. And so I urge you to have that perspective in mind. With all of the negative speech that can get out there so quickly on social media, how does that compare to empowering government to decide which speech is too dangerous, which speech is too untruthful or misleading or potentially harmful to get out there? All you have to do is look at the record of every presidential administration in the United States, governments all over the world that are purporting to protect young people or other segments of the population from potentially dangerous social media speech. And it is always disproportionately speech that is critical of government policies, critical of government officials, coming from minority voices and views, either demographic minorities or political minorities. I'd also, since all of you young people have grown up with social media, or even it existed even before you were born, you take for granted probably the positive aspects that a baby boomer like yours truly does not at all take for granted. That the Black Lives Matter movement had existed for decades and did not gain traction until it was able to harness the power of social media. Likewise with the Me Too movement. Believe me, way back in the day, long before your parents were born, there were those of us who were campaigning against sexual violence and sexual harassment and sexual assault, and really didn't gain much traction for those movements until social media came along. Party politics. Barack Obama was celebrated as the first presidential candidate who really made effective and creative use of social media. And I know historians are saying that, given his name and his politics and his race and his youth, his relative unknown status, that campaign could never have gotten off the ground without the power of social media. And to this day, I think we're seeing an unprecedented number of young, minority, demographic and religious and other minorities, young women who are successfully campaigning for political office. Well, you're the expert on electoral politics in some ways, but so let's not lose sight of the positive and do whatever we can, including through aggressive programs of media literacy, to counter the potential negative aspects.
I actually want to take a step back because I think you said something really important, and that excellent. Said a lot of important things. And it was one thing in particular you said about most people assuming that the marketplace of ideas is about the pursuit of truth. And I think a lot of people think that. And in fact, I would have to guess that many of the young people in this room probably thought about the First Amendment in those terms, about the pursuit of truth. And you're saying, no, wait a minute.
It's the pursuit of truth, not necessarily the achievement of it.
Okay. So I want to unpack that because I do think that part of what gets lost in this conversation is that people don't really understand what the First Amendment is supposed to do. And not necessarily in a sort of originalist sense of what did the founders intend the First Amendment to do, or the frankers of the First Amendment. But more so the concept of how do we operationalize the First Amendment today such that there are certain aims that First Amendment doctrine cares about, where it can be like a framework for these conversations, right? So that distinction between the pursuit of truth and actually finding truth is important. Do you think that there are other goals that we should think about in having this conversation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Franita. Definitely the pursuit of truth, but emphasis on pursuit rather than finding. And I think those were the goals that our wonderful host here listed at the beginning, that we have to be able to question everything. It's sort of like the scientific method, right? Or the Socratic method that we sometimes pursue in law school. Chipping away at falsehoods more than arriving at truth. And that's part of the Enlightenment philosophy, which one of my co-author on my latest book, Greg Lubian, said the Enlightenment was really, in some ways, it's a misnomer, because what it enlightened us about was how ignorant we are. And so to develop a humility and a curiosity. So pursuit of truth is definitely a major purpose of free speech, but it's not at all the only one. For example, the great Justice Louis Brandeis, that I alluded to earlier, talked about both the intrinsic and the instrumental purposes of speech, certainly pursuing truth, engaging in communication, resolving political differences, having a democratic a republic where we, the people, wield sovereign power. First Amendment free speech rights are essential instruments to all of those goals. And there is an additional value of self-expression, self-discovery. And the Supreme Court has rightly celebrated that even if you're not communicating with anybody else, being able to express your own ideas, to explore your own identity is really, really important. I think of the famous statement from the philosopher Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And for that reason, the Supreme Court correctly has allowed people to express themselves in ways that are controversial to other people. They may violate the norms of civility of other people. And the Supreme Court has basically said, no, for the individual to choose exactly how to express himself or herself is something that is independently important.
In some of your earlier work, you touch on some of these themes. One book that comes to mind is Defending Pornography, where you basically make the point that we don't want to censor sexual expression, in part because it can undermine the rights of women, and it can also, harm LGBTQ plus communities. To what extent is that sort of relevant to some of the cultural clashes that we're dealing with right now, right? It just seems like it's very timely.
It is very timely. So this is a very old book. Again, most of the students here weren't even born. In 1995, this book came out. I did not choose the title, which is very provocative and somewhat misleading. But so Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights. And at that time, there was a big struggle within the women's movement, of which I'm very much a part. We all oppose discrimination and violence against women, but some so-called radical feminists believe that an important strategy toward that goal was censoring, even outlawing a certain category of sexual expression, which they labeled pornography, to distinguish it from the legal concept of obscenity. I won't go into that degree of detail. But they defined illegal pornography as sexual expression that is demeaning, degrading, dehumanizing to women. And then there were others of us, the anti-censorship or pro-free speech kind of civil libertarian feminists, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was then the director of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, who said, of course we support the goals of freedom and equality and safety and dignity for women, but we believe that giving government this subjective power to decide which sexual expression is demeaning or degrading or dehumanizing is something that is going to do more harm than good. And indeed, when our neighboring country of Canada did adopt the radical feminist concept of illegal pornography, the first works that were censored were feminist works and LGBTQ works. In fact, the very first item that was censored was a story, fictional short story in a lesbian magazine about two women who fell in love with each other. And so the question to the judge and the prosecutor was, how can you possibly consider this to be demeaning or degrading to women? And the answer was, this was another era, hopefully it wouldn't happen today, but the answer was, if a woman voluntarily chooses to have sex with another woman, that is especially demeaning or degrading. So, the subjectivity that it would come back to bite precisely the relatively disempowered minority groups that were hoping it would be protective of them, we still see that. The reason I mention that old 1995 book is a couple of years ago, NYU Press approached me and said, we would like to republish Defending Pornography as part of our NYU Classics series because these issues are now recurrent, including in the context of social media, with, the very laudable goal of protecting women and protecting children against sex trafficking, against exploitation. And in fact, what we've seen is that, and there have been some laws that have been passed, and sex workers and trans communities and other minority communities are saying, no matter how well intended this was, it is actually making us less safe than we would have been. The other context in which that stigmatizing term pornography is being bandied about is in the many states and school districts where and local areas where library books and curricular material are being removed because of under the banner of pornography or sometimes even obscenity. And we've even had arrests of some librarians. And then studies have been done by the American Library Association and Pan America of what are the books that are being removed from curricula and libraries. And overwhelmingly, they are books by or about LGBTQ people. The second highest category of suppression under those laws, for some reason, are books by and about African Americans.
Oh, that's a little depressing. So I think I'll open it up for questions since we have a little bit of time. So if you have a question, please stand, identify yourself, and then ask your question. I'll be shy.
I'm Greg Keating. I teach torch, so I'll throw a torch question. A lot of some social media is trying to get around First Amendment constraints and also Section 230. And it's focused, it seems to be very plausibly, on the idea that social media websites are constructed to pursue psychological addiction. Mm-hmm. They've turned out very damning emails where people write one another inside, the companies say, the point is to addict, and generally people who are either preteen or teenagers. And it's done not by content, at least in the description of the plaintiffs, it's done by using various techniques like auto-scrolling or notifications that are designed in an attention economy to keep people's attention. And it's also targeted, of course, at people who aren't mature in a cognitive sense. And I'm curious if you have the same worries about these suits prevailing that you do about suits that are more content-based, or if you regard these things as really not being content-based. critiques that attempts to constrain social media.
Would you mind giving your best answer to that? Because you've obviously thought about it a lot. I would love to hear what you
I am perfectly comfortable. I would love to
I'll answer it.
reliable, but it would be very good towards teaching material. So you have.
Yeah.
But no, I tend to think that it would be fine to impose liability on them. But there's a very difficult issue because before we had social media, we've had advertising forever. And there are even old movies that you probably remember, The Parallax View, which are all about psychological manipulation of people. And living in the kind of economy we live in, and it's not just the economy, it also affects our politics, we're always subject to psychological manipulation. But it seems to me, at least in principle, that if you can identify something as psychological manipulation, and if the mechanism operates the way it operates, say, with gambling addiction, the same kind of mechanism psychologically that they're trying to trigger, it doesn't trigger my worries, but then I'm not a First Amendment person. I care a lot about First Amendment values, but it's not the space I live in.
Well, thank you. So I thought there might be a torts expertise there. And I'm so glad we have a torts professor here, because when you were talking about reasonable person, I was thinking, but torts law, we deal with that all the time. I actually think that the concept of addiction here is very vague and subjective and overly broad. I use very traditional media. It's actually passé, I understand. I read novels, and I happen to like listening to them because I'm always traveling, and so I can, as I'm running through airports and so forth, I can listen to the book. And Audible, every time I finish a book, it gives me the next one. I guess the term would be auto-scrolling, and it gives me a preview. And it's not only the words on a printed page. They hire marquee Hollywood star actors to perform. And you've got all the sound effects and the music. They are definitely doing everything they can to act upon and to further my addiction to the thousands of books. And, you also mentioned the analogy of advertising. I was thinking back in the 50s when I was a child, and TV was then the new medium that was widely feared. I mean, most households did not yet have a TV. I remember going down to the neighbor's house, and my parents were very scared about what it would do to my brain. But a sociologist, I think he was, named Vance Packard, wrote a book, some of you are shaking your nodding your heads, called The Hidden Persuaders. And there was this theory that advertisements on TV would subliminally flash before our eyes and not only persuade us to buy a certain kind of laundry soap, unbeknownst to ourselves, but the Manchurian Candidate kind of style would persuade us to vote for somebody, and we weren't aware that this was happening. So I think, what we are talking about is really persuasion, trying to capture somebody's interest, trying to capture somebody's attention. I am very, very strongly in favor of radical transparency, requiring these companies to disclose to us what the algorithms are, ideally to give us a choice, not only notice, but an opportunity to opt in. So these are like viewpoint neutral restrictions or consumer protections, I think is the better way to describe it. And that might have a torts analog that had been advocated for a long time now by a group of digital rights organizations spearheaded by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, also ACLU, Access Now. And it's an international group, and more than 10 years ago adopted something called the Santa Clara Principles, which recently have been updated. but they're basically that all of us, with respect to any online platform, should have the right to detailed information about what they are feeding to us and the opportunity to opt out, the opportunity to interpose our own filtering software programs from another source. And I think that kind of approach, again, it's like the more information approach rather than the restriction approach is preferable.
Yes.
Wait for the microphone so that people on Zoom can.
Thanks.
So my question was, I understand that we have to be viewpoint neutral, but how much do facts matter? So suppose there's something which most people think is untrue. Am I allowed to say that? And am I, are you or the government allowed to censor it on the basis that most people think it's untrue, given that one of the big principles is the pursuit of truth, right? So if I'm saying false stuff, is that a reason for censorship or not? How do you think about that?
Rather than giving you my answer, let me start with the Supreme Court, which in a case, I don't know, about 10 years or so ago, said in the United States, we have no need for Orwell's although he very much supported the freedom of speech in pursuit of truth, as part of that, he defended adamantly the right to say anything, including something that is false. Why? Because that is the most effective way to contest the alleged truthfulness and to show that it is false. He said there are only three logical possibilities with respect to any statement. Number one, that you think you disagree with, or you think is false, or you think is dangerous. Number one, you hear it and you think, oh, it's not false. It's persuaded me to change my mind. That's positive because you've substituted your own false idea for an actual true one. Or the second possibility is you'll hear it and you'll think, oh, well, it's got a grain of truth to it. That helps me to refine my prior understanding, again, bringing me closer to the truth. And the third possibility is you hear it and it's absolutely false. It simply reaffirms you in your own prior belief. But having been forced to contest against the falsity, you now understand more deeply your own vision of the truth and can explain it more persuasively rather than holding it just as a rote dead dogma. Now, consistent with that emergency principle that I laid out in response to your excellent first question, there are certain specific categories of false speech that directly cause specific harm other than just disagreement with the idea that the Supreme Court has allowed to be restricted. I think the three most important examples are fraud, where you intentionally make a statement to somebody intending them to rely on it to their detriment. They do, and they lose something tangible, such as money. The second example is defamation, where you intentionally say something false, harm somebody's reputation, usually with some adverse economic consequences to that person. Third example is perjury in a court of law, where you undermine the rule of law process.
And also your earlier point about transparency. I mean, I do think the system, not absolutely, but if you think about the political context, the I am so-and-so candidate and I support this message,
Right.
It has less to do with the falsity of the message and more so about forcing the person to align themselves with it.
Question that piece.
My question is about the relationship.
Who are you?
Hi, I'm Sudhir Matthew. I'm a pre-law undergraduate student. But my question is on the relationship between surveillance and free speech. Now that we have like the SAVE Act coming in and a push here and in the EU for ID registration for online services, how do you feel like how do you predict the digital panopticon is going to impact people's freedom of expression, but also people's perceived freedom of expression?
Excellent question, because there is a complex relationship between privacy or access to information, transparency, on the one hand, and free speech. On the one hand, surveillance, knowing that what you say is going to be available publicly, including to law enforcement officials, but even to the members of the general public, can well have a chilling effect on your speech. If the price of saying something is that somebody other than the person to whom you're directly communicating is going to hear it, let alone that the whole world, including law enforcement, is going to hear it very well, not express views. And this is a very common phenomenon that has been discussed a lot in the campus context, using somewhat controversial, but I think we all know what it means, cancel culture term. Surveys that are done by campus free speech organizations, including the Heterodox Academy, show that on campus there is pervasive self-censorship, not only among students, but among faculty members, not so much because of fear of the government, although one parenthesis, with the current administration's crackdown on non-citizen students, there is, and faculty members, there is a serious fear of government censorship. Putting that important exception aside, the rest of us in campus communities are self-censoring, not because we're afraid of government or faculty members, but of students, peer pressure. And so that's why I see students trying to communicate very privately, making, only to trusted friends, trying to make sure that there is no video going on. I know Harvard University, maybe others have adopted the Chatham House rules, where what is said in class is supposed to stay in class, because again, the mere fact that somebody beyond that self-selected community might hear about it is enough to dampen the discussion in the classroom. And for all of those reasons, the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently, strongly upheld the right to engage in anonymous or pseudonymous expression, with very limited exceptions, including in the campaign finance context. And even there, only above certain amounts and parties that are significant and likely to get elected, because they recognize that without the privacy and the freedom from surveillance, you're not going to have meaningful free speech. On the other hand, the First Amendment does protect freedom of access to information. And in certain contexts, knowing who is the speaker is a really important piece of information that allows us to evaluate the significance of the speech. So it's another one of these delicate balances. And the Supreme Court, in every case where there is this conflict between disclosure and transparency and right to anonymity, on the other hand, has never laid down a bright line test, elevating one automatically over the other. It's always said we have to look at all of the facts and circumstances, and in any particular situation, how do we maximally protect both?
If you think about some of the old cases, you know how weird things could get. The Virginia pharmacy case,
yes,
people didn't have access to prescription drug prices,
yes,
right? It got quite bizarre. We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I'll be right there.
You are going to get one of your students.
I was trying. Yeah, so my name is Bill Leach, and I teach in the USC Price School of Public Policy. One of my research interests is governance of homeowners associations. And homeowners associations often get entangled with free speech issues. For example, a common rule would be like you can fly the American flag, but no other flag. And if you fly the flag, it has to be right side up. It can't be upside down. My homeowners association this week is making all of us put essentially like a bumper sticker on our car, which has the logo of the HOA and a serial number. Anyway, any hot takes on free speech and homeowners associations? And maybe just one little piece makes it a little bit more interesting is scholars can't really agree on whether homeowners associations are governments or not. Sometimes they're called private governments. Technically, in California, they're 501c4 nonprofit organizations, but they act in a lot of ways like governments by regulating behavior, and they're governed by elected boards. So I don't know, any thoughts on those issues?
I'm really interested in this. I hate my homeowners.
So interesting, Bill, because my reflective answer was going to be, but that's a private voluntary organization, and they not only have their own free speech rights, but they also have their freedom of association rights, which are implicitly protected under the First Amendment. And presumably you have the right not to join that homeowners association. I recognize that means you might not buy a home in that area, but that would be a consideration you would take into account. And presumably, getting back to the electoral issue, in voting for members of the board or whoever wields the power makes the rules, you would take into account these kinds of rules. Does anybody know anything more about this? Have there been any court rules?
Relevant to this question might be the state action doctrine, right? If they have power that sort of rivals the state, we might feel comfortable finding that they're governmental actors because they are regulating behavior, but they're doing it in ways that looks like the state is acting. That's something what they cannot do with your own private property. It's like a company town.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Franita, because you spurred my memory that New Jersey is one of the states where the state Supreme Court has interpreted its equivalent to the First Amendment as extending to private sector actors. So there were a couple of cases. One involved Princeton University, a private campus. Another did involve a homeowners association. Well, it was a so-called gated community that was not allowing anybody to come in to distribute literature for political campaigns or social campaigns. And the New Jersey ACLU successfully challenged that, but only by relying on the New Jersey state constitution. If that provision hadn't existed, maybe they could have made an exception to the state action law.
Although not with this court.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, so please put your hands together for Nadine.